racism and sexual violence.
That microcosm of how we're being treated.
People weaponizing the anti-sexual violence movement felt like a critical moment.
It's how we can integrate health equity into violence prevention.
Tear up the box.
We can make change.
Preventionists and people committed to advancing social justice coming together to make each other stronger. That's what PreventConnect is all about. This year, PreventConnect brought thousands of people together from across the country to share what's happening in their communities, from intentional approaches to anti-racism, to taking on housing, to looking at violence through a public health lens. Our movement is not backing down. For this episode of PreventConnect, I connected with Ashleigh-Klein Jimenez and Shelby, two of my colleagues at PreventConnect and Valor, to look back on some of the biggest moments for prevention in 2023.
Who do we have to be in order to move this work forward?
Dang, has Ashleigh been talking to my therapist? For the second part of our 2023 Reflections episode, I'm coming back to my colleagues at Valor, Shelby and Ashleigh-Klein Jimenez, to talk about the kind of people we need to be to advance this work forward. Our conversation is touching on our favorite moments of the National Sexual Assault Conference, as well as some of the biggest cultural moments of 2023 and how they're impacting sexual violence prevention. This episode has even more resources, tools, and tips to move prevention forward for what we want to see in 2024. I'm Janae Sargent, and this is PreventConnect. Welcome back, Shelby and Ashleigh. We left off on our conversation talking about some really innovative community-based strategies. So we were talking about greening, which is putting in new green spaces, community spaces, focusing on economic justice, housing justice, and some really cool stuff that's coming out in like bigger policy-based spheres of prevention. And this is all kind of a part of a larger shift that I am noticing from school-based prevention work to more community-based stuff. What are you seeing? Can you talk to me a little bit about what that means and how you're experiencing that shift?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about, at least in California, what's been going on, because there has been a big shift for us in funding as well, and kind of moving towards that community-based approach and some of those strategies. And one of the things that I think sites are doing a really good job at is keeping in mind the importance of schools within a community as a whole, but really focusing on kind of that outer level of kind of what we talked about last time of that social ecological model, where they're trying to engage kind of this larger community while recognizing the importance of the school. So for example, we have a site in Southern California that's working on engaging parents. They are a school site and they've been doing community work for a very long time and community mobilization projects for a very long time, but they're currently located in schools, and they've been able to really do a great job of engaging like parents and community members and businesses and all of these things in their work with the students that they have at a specific school. So they're trying to kind of do that broader level changes and look at like school districts even too, and the larger city, and making changes there. But one way that they've kind of expanded that was really cool and that we got to help with at Valor was they were recognizing that the parents in their community were not coming to campus and going to their events that they were trying to hold to engage parents. They didn't have the time, they didn't have the language access, they didn't have a number of different things that the community members needed. And so the preventionists at that site were incredible and reached out to us and were like, hey, we need a tool to reach parents that they can do like on the go, like commuting parents that they can have and still engage with their youth, but in a way that isn't coming to a presentation on campus. And so we created the car conversations guide so that parents could do it in their car and share it with other community members and with neighbors and other trusted adults in the kids' lives. So that was kind of a cool way that they kind of expanded outside of just the school community and really started engaging these other layers of community members.
I really love that example, Shelby. And I think it's important for us to make the distinction between community-based and community level, because I think they're like two different things, right? So you can do individual level work in community, and that I would consider community-based work. And I think like the thing to recognize too is that a school is a community, right? It's like a smaller piece of a larger community, but it is a community. And so there is like exciting ways, like you just explained, Shelby, of doing community level work within a school setting. You know, I like to look at things more comprehensively, I guess. And like, this is something that I've learned over time. So I maybe like 5 years ago, I wouldn't have necessarily said this, but I think that like all of these pieces are extremely important. And so while like school presentations like shouldn't be the only thing we're doing, I don't think that like they're not bad, right? There's nothing bad about them. They're important. And for some people, like that's the only way that they get exposed to some of these concepts and conversations. And I don't believe that they're going to prevent sexual violence on their own. And so being able to engage the school as a whole community and look at things like policy changes, I think is really, important and necessary as part of this work.
Ashleigh, I'm really glad that you brought that up, actually, because my next question was going to be about some of the challenges that you see people dealing with when trying to shift to more community level work. And I think you named one, which is that we're not great at talking about community level work in a way that's accessible and understandable. I think my first question, I called it community-based and community level. And I know like when I was doing community level prevention work, I took that as school equals bad, farmers market equals good. Like I need to be in the community to do community level work. Maybe we should take a step back briefly and kind of define what we mean when we talk about community level prevention.
Yeah. And I mean, gosh, Janae, first of all, like, I feel like this is something that we have all done and probably all do, because we always talk about how the language that we use is confusing and not accessible. So I truly did not mean to like highlight that, but I do think that like it was an important distinction, because a lot of times we conflate community-based with community level, and I do like they are very different. So yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about community-based work, we're talking about things that are happening within the community. But like I said before, you can do individual level prevention within a community setting. So like if you held, a session about sexual violence in your neighborhood and did a presentation, that's community based, but it's still an individual level prevention strategy. So I think when we're talking about community level, it goes back to our favorite tool, the social ecological model. And community level is really referring to like the settings that we live, work, and play in. So like our schools, like we talked about, workplaces, neighborhoods, places where you are reaching larger numbers of the population than you would if you were just doing like one-on-one work or working within relationships. And it's looking at the characteristics of that community setting that are associated with either experiencing violence or creating violence. So I guess an example of like a community level intervention would be one where you don't necessarily know that you're receiving the intervention to still be impacted by it. So that could be something like, some of the work that I have really loved and appreciated are things around, like we talked about on the first part of this podcast, are things about on like greening and beautifying neighborhood spaces. Well, you don't necessarily have to be involved in that to still get to drive by and see a park that used to be kind of like not utilized for the purposes that it was originally intended for. And then suddenly you get to appreciate it and you feel more pride, and it just creates a different like feeling about your environment. So you don't have to actually create the change to be impacted by the change.
Totally. So I think like for listeners, you can be school-based and doing community level work. So like a school-based individual prevention strategy would be that healthy relationships presentation that everyone does. A school-based community level strategy might be addressing like the harassment policy at the school, or doing a train the trainer situation with teachers, or like a social norms campaign change at the school level, at the student population level. You're listening to PreventConnect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence, to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention and youth engagement, critical race theory and school climates, prevention in a digital age, and more. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is PreventConnect. So that's kind of like the first challenge, is people don't really know what it means to do community level work. What are some other challenges that you're both seeing people navigating when trying to make that shift?
Janae, I love that you highlighted that you can be a school-based program doing community level change, because we've seen that, especially in this last year, actually, a number of our rape prevention education, or RPE grantees across the state have done some incredible community level change in school-based programs. And so with this shift to doing kind of community level changes, and that's, into next year and this next cycle, we've seen them kind of, take a minute to recognize, we're doing community level changes already. It's just in a school-based program. So thank you for highlighting that. I would say one of the biggest challenges, and we touched on this a little bit in the first part of this series, but a little bit of the challenge has been really valuing partnerships and building partnerships. And community level change takes a lot of partnership building, takes a lot of like strategic partnerships too, and really working on kind of this relationships that are transformational, right? And not just transactional. Not just what can I do for you, or what can you give me like funding wise or materials or whatever the case may be, but really like, how do we build a relationship to continue doing community level changes? And so I think that's been a challenge, has been like community buy-in. Another big thing that we're seeing is like an understanding of the multiple different intersections of like cross movements with sexual violence prevention. And understanding that working with, we talked about housing a little bit, and like the intersection of that in the last part. Same with economic justice, recognizing like when you're building those partnerships, how that still impacts sexual violence prevention, and how equity for all people in multiple different areas, advancing that equity also ends sexual violence. And so I think that's been kind of a big piece that folks are struggling with, is kind of how to not use all the jargon that we see within the field and within the movement that we talk about all the time, but how to kind of have these key points when trying to engage community members as to how to do that in a concise way that makes sense for relationship building and partnerships.
Thank you for sharing, Shelby. That makes a lot of sense. And I think Ashleigh and I see very similar things at the national level when people are making that shift. It takes different skills, a lot more creativity, a lot more time, a lot more resources. It's hard to measure for yourself that you're making a difference. Like presentations, I love presentations because you see people react to it. They take a pre and a post test, and it's really easy to feel good about what you did, where community level takes a long time. So I think there is also a piece here about community-based prevention. So maybe these are two different things. We're seeing a lot of stuff, a lot of community-esque stuff happening right now. So the field of prevention is pushing people to do more community-level changes, and preventionists are doing more work in the community because doing work in schools is really hard right now. I don't know any preventionist that's like not struggling to be in schools. And there are a lot of reasons to that, but one that I've seen is a response to a lot of the backlash people are getting. So I'd love to hear from you both. What is happening culturally right now, especially when it comes to our schools, and how is that impacting prevention?
Yeah, so I think I'll start by saying that for some people, it's always been really difficult to work in the schools for various reasons, right? Sometimes it's just like getting that buy-in, convincing school administrators that this is an important piece of education and development. Sometimes it is because the subject matter, like even, before some of like the political tides turned, was just like places that people weren't willing to go. But I think what you're referring to, Janae, is really like there's been this very concentrated effort to limit some critical thinking skills that happen in schools around identity, and sexual violence prevention has somehow gotten swept up in that. Or not somehow. It makes sense, right? Because we know that the connections between sexual violence and oppression run deep. But yeah, it seems that like the backlash with things like social emotional learning and critical race theory have also now encompassed violence prevention. And a lot of folks are not feeling even safe if they are let into schools to do some of that programming based on their own identities, which I think is really, really unfortunate, because to do this is not easy anyways. And then to feel like personally threatened would be, really hard. So, and we're seeing this across the country. I don't know, Shelby, I know that you've heard more like specifically about even what's going on in California, because I think sometimes we think, oh, that happens in, these certain states that have maybe more conservative policies, but I know it's happening here too.
Absolutely. In almost every city, in every kind of environment that preventionists are working in these school-based programs, we think about certain cities where we're like, there's no way that's happening. And we're seeing that there's still these issues specifically around students of color, Jewish students right now too. There's a lot of stuff going on with anti-LGBTQ plus students too. And there's all this anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric that's happening and has been happening for a long time. And so I think that there's a number of instances that preventionists are being brought in on these conversations that a lot of folks might not necessarily see the intersection of sexual violence, but we know, like you said, Ashleigh, that, all these forms of oppression do intersect with sexual violence as well. And if community level change is about creating safe and protective environments for all people and for all students, we know that these issues where there is oppression or there is discrimination or, whatever the case may be, that is going to be part of this work as well. It has to be. And so I think I know a number of our preventionists, all the sites that I can think of that have experienced some of these things, they're doing an incredible job trying to be there for the students and for the schools and trying to provide education while also making sure that their students are kept safe. But it is really challenging. And dealing with, some of our language in the movement that's then being used against us, in some of these spaces, and just gatekeeping a lot of things now. Yeah, I mean, it has really impacted some prevention programs across California as well.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Shelby. Was it yesterday or the day before? It might have been yesterday. Outside of work, I was at a counter protest at one of our local schools because there was a demonstration, one of those like parental rights demonstrations, or they called themselves a parental rights demonstration, but they were holding signs that said like, keep groomers out of school, and like groomers teach kids to be trans. And I was sitting there with my like little rainbow flag because they stood themselves right outside of the high school. And I was like, oh, I teach healthy relationships and like empathy for LGBTQ students. He's talking about me. He's calling me the groomer right now. And that's kind of what's happening with our language being co-opted against us. It's hard to know what to do in that situation, to be like, well, I actually work in anti-grooming, so like I want to educate here. This feels really interesting. And it reminds me of a podcast that we did back in June with the Connecticut Alliance. And we were talking about anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and how preventionists often have to deal with our language being co-opted and used against us. Right now, it's anti-LGBTQ. It's also been used against us in anti-Black spaces. Ashleigh, you have heard about some pretty rough situations happening in the national prevention landscape. Can you speak to any of those at all that you've heard about as a technical assistance provider?
Sure. I mean, I said previously that preventionists, particularly like queer preventionists of color, are feeling really unsafe in some of these settings, which is rough in itself. But then there's also things happening where, if you're teaching healthy sexuality and there is obviously a component about gender identities and the expansiveness of sexuality, like, and you're in a space that's very that's very homophobic and transphobic, people are feeling like they can't actually implement the curriculum that they believe in, and that they may have evidence that it works to prevent sexual violence. So that's a really rough situation to be in. I know that preventionists are kind of grappling with, like, do we go into these spaces anyways and maybe like change our language or skip over sections? Like, how do we stay true to our values and our programming while still being able to access these spaces? And then I know like there's some like really extreme situations where like even using terminology like healthy relationships is now suddenly not allowed, which I don't really know how you get right. Or consent. Yeah, Shelby, consent. Like these things that are just like kind of basic that we take for granted are suddenly being like demonized or weaponized. So yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of that happening, and it's just, I do believe that it's like a small but very like organized and vocal group of people. But unfortunately, like that's kind of all you need, right? It's like that collective power doesn't necessarily need to be huge.
Yeah. I know that it is rough out there, and I appreciate you speaking to that. And I think that it can feel pretty grim for preventionists. Kind of, we're always hearing about this stuff. We're always kind of navigating this stuff. And I know that there are some really awesome organizations out there who we've highlighted recently, who are doing a lot of creative work at navigating these spaces and staying in the schools and doing really impactful work. What have you seen people doing about it in prevention?
We got to host a prevention town hall back in August that was specifically looking at these issues that are popping up across the country. And it was really focused on solutions. Like, what are people doing? How are they kind of like working through these things, working with the current kind of climate? And so we brought on a set of presenters working across different kinds of organizations across the country. And they had some really creative ways that they are navigating this and continuing to do awesome work to prevent sexual violence in their communities. So we have a resource that I think we'll get to soon. But some of the ways that they're doing that is, some of them are really having to make those hard decisions. Like, do we change our language? Do we, kind of shift our focus? But others were really like harnessing the power of youth leadership, because the young people who that's why they're there. They also don't agree with what's happening. And so they were really able to tap into their own collective power to push back against some of what was happening in their schools. So those were some really exciting things. And then moving in, we can reach youth outside of school settings as well, right? Youth are part of other places in the community. And so there were some great examples of still being able to do like really transformative work with young people, just not within a school setting.
That town hall was incredible. And then also having at the National Sexual Assault Conference back in August too, having that workshop that we did where we were able to kind of talk with a bunch of folks in person, which was so nice to see all those people from all over talking about some of the those key themes and strategies and navigating that pushback with their implementation of these prevention programmings. And it can be so challenging right now to try and implement, sexual and domestic violence prevention in K through 12 schools. And so it was really awesome to hear just not only like the hope that folks still have, because there was a lot of situations that we were hearing that were really difficult to hear, and a lot of gatekeeping in those communities and in those states, including in California, some of those instances. And so it was really nice to have all those participants to be able to kind of engage in that peer learning space and come up with some of their action plans and solutions. And so I think, continuing to have conversations and get people from across the country that are in these, experiencing these pushbacks, while we continue to do community level work, we're going to continue to see that. And so I'm just, I'm excited to see what kind of peer learning spaces come up in the next year or two, because this year I feel like that was a huge win across the board for PreventConnect. And I know in California, some of the peer learning spaces we've been able to really kind of identify some solid solutions for that.
PreventConnect is taking this conversation even further on our social media, and we want you to be a part of the discussion. Join in on the conversation on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we're posting excerpts from this podcast and so many more, and asking experts, practitioners, and followers like you to share your stories and ideas. Search PreventConnect on your social media platforms to get involved.
Shelby, I'm so glad that you brought up the National Sexual Assault Conference. We can't look back on 2023 and talk about the biggest moments in the anti-violence field without talking about the first in-person National Sexual Assault Conference since COVID-19 hit. So obviously we were all there. I remember collectively falling to the floor out of exhaustion with both of you at the end of the week. Valor hosted this year. What was it like to be in that space with all those people working in the anti-violence field and prevention?
Yeah, I think, we've had conversations as a staff, and then I've had conversations with folks since then. And I think the biggest the key word that's come up for a lot of folks has just been, it was overwhelming how moving and inspirational everything was. From the keynote speakers that we had to the individual sessions and getting to kind of facilitate that. It was insane. Like, it was so busy and so wild. And I totally collapsed with you on that last day. But, yeah, it was so motivating. I think I didn't really realize how big of a deal it was, especially after COVID, until I walked into that huge room and saw like the 2,000 plus people that were in there. And it still makes me emotional a little bit thinking about it, just knowing how many incredible people and minds and passionate preventionists and advocates and community folks. Like, it was incredible. And I was just so glad to be a part of it.
I felt similarly, Shelby, and just being able to feel that energy in person, it's very different than what we get to experience on Zoom. You know, I look back over the last 3 years, and there's been some amazing moments in this work that I have experienced on Zoom. And at the same time, there's nothing like being in a space with that energy, like literally, like you can feel it, you can see it, you can hear it. So that was just really exciting. And it was just so cool, I think, to meet so many new people. I always love seeing people that, you know, I see a lot on Zoom, and seeing them in person is so fun. But I had a lot of learning happening by going to a lot of the sessions of people whose work I wasn't like necessarily familiar with, and just getting to meet them and hear about like what they're excited about and what some of their challenges have been. Like, I just felt like I walked away from that conference with just like a new purpose, in wanting to continue on. But Janae, it was your first NSAC, so I want to know how it was for you.
Yeah. Woof. Really tested my my introvert boundaries. I'm like really working on being more outgoing. Most people, when I tell them I'm an introvert, they're like, that's not true. And I'm like, no, my friend, what you are seeing is what we call a farce, a mask. But I went into the conference being like, I can't wait to make friends. And I did. And I loved that. And then I passed out for like 2 weeks straight. But it was so much fun. And I think it's such an honor to be a part of planning that. I was a part of planning the LGBTQ track and the prevention track, and to be in spaces where we're really boldly saying, you know, this is where we see the field going. We value equity. We value transformative justice. It feels really cool to be able to set the tone for that and like push people. And on that note, you both were really involved with the prevention track. What were some of your favorite conversations to come out of that track this year?
Yeah, there were so many. The two that kind of come to mind for me, I think the biggest one was perpetration prevention. That was one that kind of stirred the pot a lot and kind of brought people out of their comfort zones to really talk about what that meant. And Dr. Alan Walker is incredible, and the work that they do is inspiring, and also I feel like pushes the movement in such a beautiful way, and really expands people's compassion and understanding in the direction of the movement. And so that to me was one of, like, I was honored to facilitate that conversation and just see the response from folks doing the work in prevention to some of these themes and strategies. And that was really exciting. And then with like mandated reporting, there was a huge conversation for folks working in schools around mandated reporting and challenging some of these things that folks who've been working in schools have just kind of had to deal with, and how we can shift kind of these structures and these systems to be more survivor centered, and youth centered and youth led. And so that was a really incredible conversation too.
I think for me, one thing I loved about the prevention track is that I felt like there really was something for everyone. There were some like specific examples from RPE programs. One that I didn't get to be in the room when it happened, but I was able to watch the recording. And that was the New York RPE, the New York State RPE team did a session on their shift towards an anti-racist health equity framework in primary prevention. And I just thought like that was a great session. I've said this in other spaces, so I might sound like a broken record, but like the two other standouts for me were Measuring Love as Prevention. That was presented by Audrey Jordan, who I feel like I could listen to Audrey all day. And the session was like thinking about who do we have to be in order to move this work forward? Like, how do we embrace the good parts of us and also the parts of us that are really capable of causing harm? Like, how do we sit with that? How do we face that? How do we look at our wholeness as a way to show more love, not just to like people around us, but also to ourselves? It was like a very refreshing session to have in the prevention track. And yet it was like the perfect, how could you have prevention without something like this? So I just tell everyone to go watch that one. And then I loved the one on housing justice as violence prevention. Because I thought that was like a very tangible example of what this community level work and connecting to other issues could look like in our work. And that was presented by Gabby Boyle.
And we love Gabby Boyle. We love them. And they're all over PreventConnect. You can find them on some of our web conferences, on our podcasts. It's funny when you were talking about measuring love and who we need to be and about accepting ourselves and embracing ourselves. I was like, dang, has Ashleigh been talking to my therapist? We're really doing like some shadow work stuff now. And I was like, maybe as preventionists, we should all do more shadow work. That sounds really fun for me because I'm not already doing that a lot. But I really appreciate you both bringing those up. And this is a really great way for me to plug. We are big on not gatekeeping at PreventConnect and at Valor, and that's why we have recordings of all of the sessions of the prevention track available at PreventConnect.org. Those are free, so if you're feeling really inspired by any of the workshops that we just shared about, you can go to PreventConnect.org. As long as they're in the prevention track, they will be there, and that's in our blog section. So we've spent a lot of time looking back on 2023, and it has been a really big year. I think we could talk for a whole other hour about other stuff that's been going on this year, but I want to look a little bit ahead too. What are you both hoping to see in 2024 when it comes to sexual violence prevention?
I think that this is kind of like a personal like goal for me. And that's just to like continue to build my skills in talking about prevention using plain language. I recently had an opportunity to present in another state at their prevention summit. And part of like us working on that presentation was that they really wanted me to use plain language. They were going to have self-advocates, which is another term for people with disabilities who were going to be participating. And so it was really important that, I was using language that resonated with everyone. And plain language is not just good for people with like a developmental disability, but for anyone, right? Like anyone who doesn't do this work, like plain language can be like incredibly useful and accessible for. And so, I try to do that already, but like that was such a good practice. And it was amazing because I felt like everyone there, including the self-advocates, were able to participate in the conversation and, share their expertise and be seen as the leaders that they are in prevention. And so I just really want to practice that, because that allowed a rich conversation that may not have happened if I had used language that didn't resonate with people. People weren't able to connect to or at the worst understand. So that's something that I'd love to see. And then I just also would love to see more examples of community-led work. So community leadership, I think, is so important.
One of the things I'm really hoping to see in this next year is taking that community-led goal a little bit deeper and doing really youth-led. And really youth-led, and not kind of this, we have a tendency in a lot of spaces, but in this movement, we see this too of, kind of a paternalistic, kind of ageist approach sometimes to organizing. And I think that is something that really needs to change and shift in order for us to move forward as a movement. And so really being youth-led and how to kind of hone in on what that means and what that looks like. So that they have access to kind of these larger spaces and larger conversations and input. Because so much of our focus in prevention a lot of times is on youth and on communities. And, if we're prescribing things, that's not really including them and giving them a real voice in those conversations. And so that's one of my goals. And then another thing I'd really like to see is kind of on that access piece is, language access, and really understanding what that means in our movement and in our field, and how that is so important in advancing equity and making sure that we have, linguistic justice and things like that for folks in our trainings and our web conferences and materials that we put out. That's definitely something that, we have resources, and I know funding can be challenging for folks, but I think that that's something that we can, if we prioritize it, we can find the funding and figure out how to do that. And
I know, part of our role at Valor, at PreventConnect, as TA providers in California and across the country, is to help people get there. And, rather than, I'm not going to list them all out on this podcast, but I might ask for some of your favorites. There are so many resources out there, free resources, downloadables, web conferences. People are already doing this work, and it's not on, if people are listening to this, it's not on you to figure it all out yourself. That's what we're here for. So a big part of this podcast, I'm going to be compiling all of the resources that we've talked about, or resources that touch on things like language justice, in the show notes. So you can kind of click around and find what works for you. But Ashleigh and Shelby, I kind of want to close out just asking, what's one resource in the movement that you're really loving right now, or that you're seeing people really grabbing onto?
The first one that comes to my mind that I feel like I've shared with every person that has reached out to me in the last 5 months or so, whether they asked for it or not, I was like, hey, this is really cool. Check it out. There is a really cool zine that comes from Kahari Jackson and Malcolm Shanks on decolonizing gender. And it is so cool. And I think is just, relevant to conversations we've had, but also just for prevention in general. I think it's a really awesome guide and reflection on gender identity and race and colonialism. And it's incredible. So I would definitely check that out. That's the first one that comes to mind.
For me, gosh, this is a hard question because there's so many, but connecting back to the Measuring Love session at NSAC, there is a new chapter, I guess, in the Measuring Love brown paper anthology called Healing Love into Balance. Maybe I shouldn't say it's new. It's the newest. And first of all, the artwork is absolutely gorgeous. It's so beautiful to look at, but, it's like giving yourself a warm hug, and also a pep talk that you have work to do at the same time. So I would just, I love to just, share that.
Everyone's listening to my therapist.
It's really funny, Janae, that you said shadow work, because that's actually not a term that I was familiar with, but they use that. They use shadow and light work. They use those terms in measuring love. So, I don't know. There's something going on.
Well, thank you both. Thank you so much. Those both sound amazing. And I don't think I'd really heard of either of those. So I get to learn something too. Thank you both so much for being here for this conversation and taking a look back with me. I'm so grateful to know you and work with you. And I'm excited to see what 2024 brings.
Yes,
me too.
Thank you so much for having us. It's always great to be with you both and have these conversations. I really value getting to learn and just collaborate on this. So thank you for having us too.
At PreventConnect, we strive to center our audience in all of our content, from the selection of topics on our podcasts, web conferences, and blogs, to resources we bring in, to tools we offer. Do you have an idea for a topic that you would like to see us cover? Have feedback about something you liked or would like to see improved? Or know someone doing innovative work in prevention and health equity? We want to hear from you. We're pushing out a quick, anonymous survey meant to inform and improve our work so that we can get better and be the most relevant resource to you that we can be. Your feedback matters. We read every response and use them to plan out our yearly content and topics. Plus, filling out our survey enters you in a drawing to win a $200 gift card. You can find the link to our survey in the description of this podcast, on our Instagram, and at PreventConnect.org.